There's something surreal about sipping your morning coffee and watching 20 strangers in yoga pants salute the sun on your driveway, especially when you're holding a Glock 19 and they still don't move. One woman actually turned to me and whispered, "Shu, your aura is disrupting our flow." I blinked. Not because I was surprised, but because I was trying to decide if I was legally allowed to respond with a warning shot or if I should just pour another cup of coffee and let the circus continue. Welcome to my Tuesday morning. I moved to this neighborhood to find peace. That's the punchline now. After 20 years in the service, I wanted silence, trees, maybe a shed out back where I could run drills and pretend the world was still orderly. I bought this house because it sat at the edge of the HOA jurisdiction line. Technically, I wasn't under their rulebook. Technically. That detail was lost on Karen. Not just any Karen. The Karen. She introduced herself with a clipboard in one hand and a lavender muffin in the other, as if one could soften the blow of the other. "Hi, I'm Karen, I run the HOA here. You must be new. We like to keep things balanced." She said it like she was recruiting me into a cult. At first, I played nice. I nodded, smiled, accepted the muffin, and let her drone on about bylaws, noise levels, lawn heights, paint colors, and something called communal aesthetic energy. I chalked it up to suburbia. I dealt with worse. When she finally left, I dropped the muffin in the trash and triple-checked the property line markers. My driveway, my house, and my yard were entirely outside of their jurisdiction. She had no power over me. Or so I thought. 3 days later, I found my mailbox decorated with fairy lights. I thought some kids were playing a prank, but then I saw the chalk drawings on the driveway. Mandalas. Crystals placed around the edge like some sort of pagan force field. And then came the music, low, droning flute sounds, and the smell of eucalyptus. It hit me as I stepped outside. They were setting up. On my driveway. For yoga. I stood frozen on the porch in my robe and slippers, watching as a small crowd of women in spandex stretched, adjusted mats, and positioned themselves like they were about to audition for a cult-themed flash mob. At the center of them all was Karen, wearing a white headband and a smug smile. I cleared my throat. No response. I stepped closer. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice even. Karen opened one eye mid-pose and held up a finger, the universal sign for, "Shut up, I'm busy being superior." I blinked again. This was new. I'd faced insurgents with better manners. Once the class ended, Karen finally acknowledged me. She walked up, sipping from a coconut water bottle like she'd just descended from Mount Olympus. "Oh hey. Didn't want to bother you," she said cheerfully. "We just thought your driveway had the perfect alignment for sunrise flow. You've got such peaceful vibes here." I didn't say anything at first, mostly because I was trying to suppress an aneurysm. Then I pointed to the driveway and said, very clearly, "This is private property." Karen laughed like I'd told a joke. "No need to get possessive. We're all part of the same spiritual neighborhood family." That was when I knew I wasn't dealing with a rational human being. She was the final boss of entitled suburbia. I tried reason. I tried explaining property lines, zoning rights, boundaries. Karen's smile never wavered. "The HOA approved it," she said flatly. "We designated this as a temporary mindfulness zone during mornings." I stared at her. "I'm not in the HOA." She didn't blink. "We believe in shared energy spaces. You'll understand once you've opened your third eye." I opened my third door instead. The one to my garage. Inside was my pride and joy, a private, fully legal, soundproofed firing range I'd spent 6 months building. A little overkill? Maybe. But in that moment it felt like destiny. I didn't fire a shot that morning. But I let her see it. Just a glimpse. Just enough to plant a seed. She looked past me into the dimly lit room with the steel targets, ear protection, safety signs, and neatly stacked ammo cases. Her smile faltered for a moment, then returned with an edge. "Guns disrupt the spiritual harmony of the community," she said. Later that day, a note appeared on my front door, written in calligraphy. Please remove all aggressive energy items from the vicinity of the communal yoga zone. Love and light, Karen. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my jerky. That night, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I pulled out my old maps, zoning files, land use documents, the kind of thing I used to deal with during operations overseas. Karen had no clue that the only reason she was even able to breathe in my vicinity was because I let her. She also had no idea I had already contacted a lawyer and filed a complaint with the city about unpermitted use of private property. The next morning, I posted signs at the edge of the driveway. Private property. Active firing range. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Karen tore them down within the hour and replaced them with laminated, "Welcome to Mindful Mornings" flyers. The HOA sent me a notice, unsigned of course, demanding that I cease and desist all firearm activity that disrupts spiritual gatherings. That was the final straw. I walked out onto my porch during the next yoga session, loaded a watermelon onto my steel target downrange, took a slow sip of my coffee, and fired one round. The melon exploded in a glorious, wet, red burst. Karen screamed. One of her followers dropped into a fetal position and started sobbing. I turned, raised my voice, and said, "That was downrange, on my property, within legal decibel limits, and perfectly safe." Karen was shaking. "You can't do that," she yelled. "It's hostile." I smiled politely. "You're doing yoga on my firing range. I think we're both feeling a little tense." I didn't want war. But she brought her little army of mats and mantras onto my battlefield. And now the rules were about to change. "You said." I thought the watermelon incident might be the end of it. I figured once Karen saw that I wasn't bluffing, that I actually trained people on this very firing range and had the legal documentation to back every square inch of it, she'd take her mats and scented oils and crawl back into whatever HOA boardroom she slithered out of. But I underestimated the power of delusion wrapped in yoga pants and self-righteousness. Because the very next morning, not only was she back, she brought more people. More mats. More incense. And this time, she had a clipboard. I was standing at my window, drinking my coffee, when I counted no fewer than 27 women setting up camp across my driveway, spilling halfway into my gravel path, and right up to the edge of the firing lane. I watched as Karen strutted across the pavement, marking spots with chalk, waving her clipboard like it was a royal decree. She didn't even glance toward the house. It was like I didn't exist. Like she'd decided the explosion of produce the day before was just a minor spiritual inconvenience. I stepped outside and cleared my throat. Karen didn't even flinch. "You're not seriously doing this again," I said calmly. She turned slowly, eyes wide with feigned innocence. "We're simply reclaiming sacred space," she said, like she was marching with Gandhi instead of trespassing on private land. "The HOA board passed an emergency motion declaring your driveway part of the extended community wellness zone." I stared at her, stunned. "That's not even a thing." She smiled. "It is now." I called my lawyer. He laughed for 10 seconds straight before choking out, "Yeah, that's not how laws work." He recommended I start documenting everything. Photos, videos, paper trail, and keep my cool, no matter how infuriating she got. So I started snapping pictures. I took video of them blocking the firing lane. I recorded audio of their droning chants and the moment Karen referred to me as a violent masculine energy presence. Karen upped the ante later that day by delivering a fresh notice. This one was printed on embossed paper with a fake seal that said HOA Unified Council. It demanded I cease all ballistic activity until the spiritual program concludes. I stared at it, then looked back at her. "You know you're not even on my property legally, right?" She tilted her head like a confused puppy and said, "Legal lines are just constructs. We're working toward unity." I was working toward a headache. To make matters worse, Karen sent out a community-wide email. Subject line: Emergency HOA Update: Combating Aggression with Mindfulness. In it, she called me a disruptive presence, accused me of spiritually threatening her guests, and proposed a full HOA vote to place my land under collective neighborly management. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone. But when I went to the mailbox that afternoon, a folded paper fluttered out. It was a handwritten note from my neighbor, John. He apologized. Didn't know she was trying to do that. I voted no. This is insane. Let me know if you need anything. It was the first crack in Karen's power I'd seen. Not everyone was on her side. Some of them were just scared to speak up. Still, she pressed on. A few days later, I heard a buzz overhead. At first, I thought it was a wasp or a bird. Then I looked up and saw the glint of plastic and spinning blades. A drone. Circling my property. Dipping low over the firing range. I followed its path until I spotted a teenager a few houses down with a controller in hand. Karen was standing beside him, grinning like a game show host. I walked over and asked if they were spying. Karen smiled sweetly and said, "We're documenting violations for our safety report." I asked if they had permission to record over private property. The kid hesitated, but Karen answered for him. "If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind transparency." I didn't say a word. I just walked back inside, grabbed my own drone blocking gear, and activated the frequency disruptor I'd legally bought for this very kind of nonsense. The drone jerked midair, spun like a drunk frisbee, and crash-landed in my lawn. Karen gasped like I'd just shot her dog. "You attacked it," she shouted. "That's destruction of property." I picked it up and handed it back to the kid. "Tell her next time, get a warrant." That night, I reviewed the drone footage. The drone had captured everything, from Karen's trespassing to her unlicensed yoga instructor leading sessions within feet of live training equipment. My lawyer nearly choked when I sent it to him. "This is gold," he said. "You've got zoning violations, trespassing, safety breaches, and a possible illegal business operation if she's charging for these classes." So I made a call. The next morning, a county inspector showed up. Unmarked car. Clipboard. Sunglasses. The works. He walked the property line with me, reviewed my permits, nodded at the soundproofing and security systems, and asked about the yoga mat. I pointed to the footage. He didn't say much, just scribbled notes and asked if I had any documentation of complaints. I handed him the HOA notices, the emails, the video of Karen saying, "We're taking spiritual ownership." He nodded again and said, "You'll be hearing from us soon." Karen saw him leaving and immediately ran over in her flowing robe like she was late for a cult audition. She tried to sweet-talk him, asking if he needed essential oils or chakra alignment. He just said, "Ma'am, do you have a permit to operate an organized class on private property?" Her face dropped. She stammered. He took a photo of her laminated sign and walked off without another word. Later that evening, she received a formal cease and desist letter taped to her door. I watched her read it from my porch, coffee in hand. Her jaw clenched. Her fists balled. But she didn't scream. Not yet. Instead, she turned, made eye contact with me, and did something I didn't expect. She bowed. Not out of respect. It was a theatrical, passive-aggressive yoga bow, the kind cult leaders do when they're pretending to forgive you while plotting your demise. I didn't blink. I just raised my mug in a toast. Karen had just taken her first official loss, and judging by the look in her eyes, she wasn't going down without one more insane stunt. She wanted control. She wanted power. But now she was rattled. And I knew something was coming. Something bigger. Something more desperate. And I was ready. For a few days after the cease and desist notice, things actually got quiet. No chanting, no drone flybys, no stray yoga mats drifting onto my driveway like lost sheep. I let myself believe, just for a moment, that Karen had accepted defeat. Maybe she'd found a new spiritual battleground or discovered a patch of grass somewhere else to pose dramatically in front of. But peace in this neighborhood, much like in war zones, was always temporary. Karen wasn't retreating. She was regrouping. It started subtly. Flyers showed up around the neighborhood, on doors, community boards, even stuffed into mailboxes. "Reclaim the energy," they said in block letters, framed with pictures of sunsets, crystals, and suspiciously generic smiling people. The fine print said, "The HOA Wellness Committee invites you to protest hostile environments and support unity through yoga, music, and peaceful demonstration." I recognized the language immediately. It was the kind of stuff insurgents would use when they were trying to win hearts and minds before a full-blown coup. Then came the rumors. I overheard them in the grocery store, at the gas station, and through the open windows of passing golf carts. "Did you hear about the guy on the corner with the guns? Apparently he screams at women doing yoga. I heard he threatened the HOA with a grenade launcher." That last one made me snort out loud. Someone really thought I had an RPG stashed in the garage. I didn't, for the record, but part of me wished I did just to sell the image they'd already painted. It became clear Karen was running a smear campaign. Subtle, underhanded, and effective. People started crossing the street to avoid me. One neighbor I'd chatted with a dozen times suddenly acted like I was radioactive. I even caught a group of teenagers pretending to aim imaginary rifles at each other while pointing at my house. Karen wasn't just trying to reclaim space, she was trying to isolate me, to turn the neighborhood into her private cult compound. I decided to fight back, not with weapons, but with something far more dangerous: barbecue. I planned a cookout. Veterans Appreciation, open to all neighbors. Free food, drinks, music, games for kids. Nothing fancy, just burgers, hot dogs, and an open grill on my very own firing range lawn. I sent out real invitations, included my contact number, and even called in a few favors from my old unit. They were more than happy to show up and mingle. Some wore casual shirts, others sported hats with their branch insignias. I didn't tell them about Karen. I didn't need to. They smelled the HOA weirdness the second they pulled into the neighborhood. To my surprise, people came. Not everyone, but enough to make an impact. John from next door brought his kids. Mrs. Kowalski came with a cherry pie and a suspicious glint in her eye that told me she never liked Karen to begin with. Even the mailman stuck around for a plate of ribs. One woman walked up nervously and asked, "You're not really dangerous, right?" I looked at her and said, "Only to people who try yoga on my driveway." She blinked, then laughed, and I saw the tide starting to turn. Meanwhile, Karen stood across the street, watching from behind her lavender-colored mailbox, arms crossed like a general surveying enemy territory. She didn't come over. But she didn't leave either. Just stood there, judging, fuming, probably wondering why her smear campaign hadn't driven me out yet. Then I saw her pull out her phone and start recording. I made sure to give her something to film. I walked over to the grill, flipped a burger with flair, and shouted to my buddy Mitch, "Hey, you remember that time in Afghanistan when you used a spatula as a weapon?" Laughter erupted. Cameras clicked. And somewhere in that chaos, I knew Karen was losing control of the narrative. But she wasn't done yet. A few days later, I caught wind of a new plan. Karen had moved her yoga class, technically, off my property. She was now holding it at the edge of her front lawn, which happened to be directly across from my house. Close enough to still be obnoxious, loud, and invasive. They set up speakers this time, playing soft chants and nature sounds at a volume that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't illegal, but it was war by other means. I tried to ignore it. For 3 days, I wore headphones. I played music. I worked in the garage. But on the 4th day, something changed. Her so-called yoga instructor showed up with a clipboard and began directing traffic. Cars lined the street. A few parked halfway into my gravel. Someone knocked over my trash bin. I stepped outside to ask what was going on, and that's when I heard it. Karen's voice over the speaker, welcoming her guests to Sacred Flow Sunday, a healing gathering for those harmed by neighborhood hostility. I almost laughed. Harmed? The only thing anyone here had been harmed by was her ego. But what really set me off was when she brought out a news crew. Local cable access, clearly tipped off by someone. A guy with a camera, a woman with too much makeup, and a microphone that looked like it had been held together with duct tape. They interviewed Karen on her front lawn. I couldn't hear everything she said, but I caught phrases like toxic masculinity and weaponized territory. The camera panned toward my house. I stepped back inside before they caught me flipping them off. That night, I went online and did some digging. Karen's instructor, Mala something, wasn't certified. Not only that, she'd been sued in a different county for causing heat exhaustion during a hot yoga retreat in a tent with no ventilation. I pulled public court documents, lawsuits, complaints, cease and desist letters. She wasn't some guru. She was a liability wearing beads and linen pants. I compiled everything into a neat little packet and sent it to my lawyer. I also included drone footage, screenshots of her event ads, and a copy of the HOA bylaws that specifically prohibited commercial activity on residential property without a permit. Then I anonymously tipped off a few reporters. Real ones this time. 3 days later, the local news ran a segment titled Zen or Scam: The Truth Behind HOA Yoga Events. They showed footage of Karen's operation, including a brief clip of her describing my driveway as a place of fear and violence. Then they cut to a zoning expert explaining that everything she was doing was technically illegal and potentially dangerous. They interviewed a former class participant who said she felt pressured to pick a side and left when things got too weird. Karen lost it. I mean, full-on meltdown. She stormed into the HOA office, screaming about betrayal and conspiracies. Someone leaked footage of her shouting at the receptionist, demanding names, threatening to sue the city. Within hours, the HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss her behavior. And I heard, through a very reliable grapevine, that the board was starting to fracture. Karen had spent so much time trying to paint me as the villain, she hadn't noticed her own image starting to crumble. And I wasn't even done yet, because the next time she stepped foot on my property, I had a surprise waiting. A very loud, very legal one. The knock came at 7:42 in the morning, just as I was lacing up my boot. Not the usual HOA passive-aggressive letter taped to the door kind of knock. This was an impatient, knuckle-busting bang that screamed drama. I opened the door and, like clockwork, there stood Karen, clipboard in hand, hair tied so tight it looked like it was trying to pull her face into a permanent scowl. Behind her were 2 men I'd never seen before, dressed in cheap polos with embroidered logos reading, HOA Compliance Enforcement. They looked like mall cops on a field trip. Karen didn't even say hello. She launched into her declaration like she was delivering a royal decree. We're here to deliver formal HOA disciplinary actions for ongoing violations of community unity standards and aggressive conduct. I stared at her for a full 3 seconds before replying, "Those aren't real things." She thrust a folder at me with a flourish. "The board has voted to suspend your community participation right. Effective immediately." I took the folder, opened it, and nearly laughed. It was full of nonsense, fabricated infractions like emotional noise pollution, non-consensual energy projection, and my favorite, failure to participate in communal alignment rituals. I looked up at the 2 fake enforcers. "You guys know this isn't a cult, right?" One of them opened his mouth, then closed it. Karen, however, stood firm. "If you do not comply," she said with all the flair of a villain in a bad soap opera, "we'll be forced to escalate." I nodded slowly, then stepped back, reached for the folder on the hallway table, and handed her a perfectly stapled set of documents. "Great. Then here's mine. Legal cease and desist from my attorney. Includes footage, zoning maps, and a full list of infractions committed by you, your yoga instructor, and your flying peeping drone." She hesitated, took the packet, and skimmed the first page. Her face changed. Slightly. She wasn't expecting this. She wasn't used to being met with paper that had real consequences. She flipped through, found the court filing date, saw the official notary stamp, and for a moment she looked like a balloon losing air. But the moment didn't last. She straightened up, smiled like a cult leader under pressure, and said, "You'll regret this. The community will turn against you." Then she turned on her heel and marched down the driveway like she'd just declared war on behalf of the moon and stars. The two faux enforcers followed, clearly less convinced than when they arrived. By the end of the day, half the neighborhood knew something had gone down. And that something exploded into full-scale HOA panic when Karen received her own official letter from the county. A real one. Signed, stamped, and quite thorough. Violations of zoning ordinances. Unlicensed operation of commercial event. Trespassing. False representation of HOA authority over non-governed property. It hit her like a freight train of reality wrapped in legal jargon. I watched her read it from my porch. She stood frozen for nearly 5 minutes. Her lips moved as she read the fine print. Her eyes flicked toward my house once. I gave her a little wave and went back to polishing my gear. That evening, the HOA board met for an emergency session. Word traveled fast. This wasn't just about yoga anymore, it was about liability. Karen had gone rogue, used HOA resources for her own weird agenda, and dragged the board into a potential lawsuit. Some members were furious, others scared, and a few, I suspected, had always hated her and were just waiting for an excuse. I didn't go to the meeting. I didn't have to. 10 minutes after it started, one of the board members, Mark, a quiet guy who ran the community newsletter, slipped a copy of the agenda under my door. Highlighted at the bottom were 2 glorious words: Karen's suspension. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The next morning, a community-wide email went out. A generic statement about leadership transition and ongoing investigation into misuse of HOA resources. Karen was off the board. Just like that. No fireworks, no screaming. Just a polite removal, like a rotted tooth finally yanked out by the root. But anyone who thought she'd go quietly hadn't been paying attention. Because 3 days later, Karen tried to countersue me. It was laughable. Her lawyer, clearly some budget Craigslist hire, filed a complaint claiming emotional distress, social alienation, and damage to her spiritual brand. Yes, that was actually in the paperwork. Spiritual brand. My lawyer took one look at the document and laughed so hard he had to sit down. "I've seen amateur hour before," he said, "but this is full-blown karaoke night." We went to court. Small claims. Low stakes, except for the fact that the courtroom was full. Neighbors. Reporters. Curious onlookers. Even a few off-duty cops who had apparently heard about the case through the grapevine. Karen showed up in all white, headband gleaming like a rejected cult leader at a Burning Man audition. I wore jeans and a clean shirt. She made a speech. Oh, did she ever? She wept, described how my energy had disrupted her balance, how the sound of my target practice had shattered her meditations, how she feared for her life every time I polished a rifle in my own garage. It was a performance worthy of a Razzie. And the judge? Unamused. When my turn came, I handed over a single flash drive. The judge plugged it in. Up came the drone footage, the interviews, the faked flyers, the yoga mats on my property, and finally, the clip of Karen saying to her class, "We're taking spiritual ownership of this space." The judge paused, looked at her, and said flatly, "Is this you?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. The room was dead silent. Case dismissed. Her complaint was tossed so fast it practically hit the wall on the way out. And then came the kicker. My lawyer had filed a small counterclaim for damages. Nothing huge, just enough to make a point. And we won. Karen had to pay me. Not much. But enough to make her flinch. Enough to make it real. Outside the courtroom, she stormed past me, muttering something about corrupted courts and betrayal. I let her go. There was nothing left to say. That evening, I stood in my garage, looking over my range. Clean. Quiet. Mine. No chanting. No mats. No unauthorized yoga. For the first time in weeks, I felt that silence I had moved here for. I brewed a fresh cup of coffee, walked out onto my now empty driveway, and breathed. And then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Just one sentence. See you Sunday. Karen wasn't done. Not yet. And I had a feeling her next move would make everything that came before look like warm-up stretches. Sunday arrived with a calmness so unnatural it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The sky was too blue, the birds too quiet, and the air had that eerie stillness you only notice when you've been trained to anticipate ambushes. I woke early, ran a systems check on my range equipment, verified all security feeds, and made sure the motion sensors were active. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. Karen's message had been short, but the tone carried weight. It wasn't over, and I knew better than to underestimate someone whose ego had been bruised in public. By mid-morning, I saw the first sign of movement. A white van pulled into the cul-de-sac and stopped 2 houses down. A woman got out wearing a headset and carrying a clipboard. She started walking house to house, handing out small pamphlets. Then 2 more vehicles arrived, SUVs with tinted windows and people in matching yoga attire unloading portable speakers, folding chairs, and more mats than I thought existed in this town. They weren't setting up on Karen's lawn. They weren't even pretending to stay within the rules this time. They were coming for my driveway again. I didn't step out. I let the cameras do their job. From the upstairs window, I watched Karen appear like the star of a cult-themed Broadway musical. Flowing white robe, arms raised to the sky, a smug expression of false humility etched across her face. She made a show of blessing the ground, even knelt and touched the gravel like it was holy soil. Then she stood, turned to the growing crowd of about 30 people, and began to speak into a microphone. She had a stage this time. A literal platform someone had set up across my front yard, just past the edge of the driveway line. I caught every word through the live feed from the audio mic planted under the mailbox. Today we reclaim this space for peace, for balance, for those who have been silenced by aggression and forced into spiritual exile. The crowd clapped politely. She continued, "This man, this agent of hostility, has used fear to divide us. But we are not afraid. We will bring light into this darkness." I almost laughed. Almost. But then someone in the crowd started hammering in a wooden post. A large painted sign followed. HOA protected spiritual site. They were claiming my land again. Only this time they brought props. I dialed the non-emergency line and gave a calm, detailed report of what was unfolding. Trespassing, unauthorized gathering, possible harassment. The dispatcher said an officer would be en route shortly. Still, I didn't go outside. Karen took the microphone again. "Let us begin the healing ceremony," she said, then motioned for her so-called instructor. Mala, the same uncertified fraud with a track record of overheating yoga tents. The instructor stepped up with a singing bowl and a small drum, then launched into some kind of chant while waving burning sage dangerously close to one of my hedges. 2 of her followers began pouring what looked like salt in a circle around my mailbox. That's when I activated the speaker system. A few months back, I'd wired the range with directional speakers for training simulations. Today, I had them pointed right at the edge of the driveway. I hit play on a track I'd prepped for a moment just like this. A series of loud, crisp, gun range beeps followed by the unmistakable sound of a metal target being hit again and again. Sharp, clean, and entirely legal. The effect was immediate. Half the yoga group flinched. Some ducked. A few looked around wildly like they were waiting for bullets to start flying. Karen held her ground at first, trying to calm them. "It's just noise. Don't let it disrupt your aura." But then I followed it with a second sound, a deep, thundering bass blast of military drill cadence. The kind that gets into your bones. I watched as the formation began to unravel. Someone tripped over a mat. Another dropped her incense burner and let out a startled scream. The salt pourers scattered. Karen fumbled with the mic. "Do not yield to the aggressor." "This is a test," she shouted, but no one was listening anymore. 2 women grabbed their yoga bags and fast walked off the property. Another woman was on her phone, muttering something about this not being what she signed up for. Just as things hit maximum chaos, the police cruiser rolled in. Officer Jenkins, a middle-aged man who'd been on the force since the neighborhood was built, stepped out and took one look at the scene before walking directly to Karen. I didn't hear what she said, but I could see her animated gestures, her frantic pointing at my house, the dramatic clenching of her fists. Jenkins nodded calmly, let her rant, then walked over and knocked on my door. I opened it and handed him a USB stick. Audio recordings, video, property line maps, and court orders. She's back on my property. Again. Jenkins sighed. I figured. We've been hearing a lot about this. Mind if I confirm the property markers? I led him down the walkway, showed him the clearly marked line in the gravel. He nodded, walked back to Karen, and said something that turned her face sheet white. A few minutes later, she was escorted off my property. Not arrested. Not yet. But removed. Her followers, scattered and confused, followed behind like a deflated parade. As she passed my porch, she looked up and hissed, "This isn't over." But it was. 3 days later, the final nail hit the coffin. A video of Karen's Sunday stunt, complete with her speech and the chaotic retreat, was posted anonymously on the community Facebook page. Then the local news picked it up under the headline, "Spiritual Invasion or Suburban Circus?" The footage went viral. Comments poured in from people across the country, mocking everything from her outfit to her manufactured victimhood. The HOA board, now under new leadership, issued a formal apology to me. They revoked all permissions Karen had forged, clarified that my property was never subject to HOA use, and confirmed that she had misrepresented the organization repeatedly. Karen was officially banned from holding any event, spiritual or otherwise, within the HOA's jurisdiction. And to add a cherry on top, a cease and desist order from the county itself landed on her doorstep for unauthorized event hosting. A week passed. The neighborhood went quiet, peaceful, the kind of silence I had come here for in the first place. I cleaned my gear, restocked my range, and finally repainted the gravel line at the edge of the driveway. Just for good measure, I installed a new sign. Private driveway. Not a temple. Not a yoga studio. Not a commune. Trespassers will be enlightened by 9mm. I haven't seen Karen since. Word is she moved her classes to a park on the far side of town. A park with geese. Aggressive ones. Some say she got chased into a pond during a sunrise salutation. Poetic, really. As for me, I still get the occasional smirk from passing neighbors. Some wave. Some bring pie. A few ask for shooting lessons. I just smile, sip my coffee, and enjoy the peace that comes when even the boldest Karen learns that messing with a retired firearms instructor's driveway isn't a path to enlightenment. It's a fast track to a very loud, very legal, very final kind of karma.